everybody, and welcome to Lesson 4.3, Public and Private Land Use. The content in this video is aligned to the third edition of Environmental Science for AP and is aligned to CED Units 5.10 and 5.13. One of the major methods of resource use is the way in which humans use a variety of land resources to meet our needs. Here are our content objectives for this lesson. When humans use natural resources, they alter natural systems. And humans can mitigate their impact on land and water resources through sustainable use. At the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the different types of public land, explain how public land is managed, including federal agencies responsible for each type, identify the different methods of urban development, explain how urban land is used, describe the effects of urbanization on the environment, and describe methods for mitigating problems related to urban runoff. This leads us to our guiding question. How are public and private lands used differently? Let's begin our conversation with a review of the types of public land. International categories of public land include national parks, managed resource areas, habitat and species managed areas, strict nature reserves, and wilderness, protected landscapes and seascapes, and national monuments. The United States uses some of those categorizations, but specifies them in several different ways. The goal of most management plans for public land is resource conservation ethic, which seeks to use the resource in such a way that it provides the greatest good for everyone involved. The practice uses observation of resource and monetary value to make these decisions. The U.S. also uses a variety of categories of purpose for the lands under governmental management. Remember that the government holds public land in trust for the American people. There are 4 agencies that are responsible for managing the land under government control. The Bureau of Land Management, which oversees grazing, mining, timber harvesting, and recreation. The U.S. Forest Service, which oversees timber harvesting, grazing, and recreation. The National Park Service, which manages recreation and conservation, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which manages wildlife conservation, hunting, and recreation. It is important to note here that 57% of the federal land in the U.S. falls under the purview of the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service. We have to this point already discussed rangelands and forests, so we'll move on to discussing the remaining types of public land. National parks may be made up of overlapping areas of forest, wilderness, and historical monuments. These parks are managed by the National Park Service and are held under moderate restriction. This means that there are some things that are allowed within the park and some things that are prohibited. Often, companies require permits and other permissions to do certain things within a national park. For example, a private citizen may want to enjoy the park through the use of an ATV. However, in many areas, the use of motorized vehicles is prohibited due to the impact on biodiversity and ecosystem health. There is a strict balance that needs to be made between allowing the citizens to make use of this land, but to also maintain it for others. Wilderness, wetlands, and wildlife refuges and sanctuaries are all managed under restricted uses, meaning that there are very few things that can be done there without a very special permit. And often, public citizens are not allowed to be there due to specific biodiversity or conservation policies. Wilderness is managed in part by all of the government agencies, while wetlands, refuges, and sanctuaries are managed exclusively by the Fish and Wildlife Service. All public lands fall under the purview of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, which sets guidelines for the use of any of these resources. NEPA is designed to provide a regulatory process, which includes an exploration of the environmental assessment of any project that is using federal money or requires federal permits. The major component of NEPA is what is known as an environmental impact statement. This is a hefty pre-project that requires an outline of the scope and purpose of the project, the environmental context, suggesting alternative approaches to the project, and it analyzes the environmental impact. In many areas, an environmental mitigation plan is required to address the impact, as well as provide any prevention methods for endangered species nearby. These lands are also managed under the Endangered Species Act, which applies to those areas where there are endangered or threatened species. This law makes it illegal to disturb, kill, own, transport, or otherwise interfere with the reproduction or natural habitat of organisms identified under the law. Take a moment and look at the distribution of public land in the United States. As we can see, the vast majority of public land is held in the western part of the U.S. Why might this be? We know that prior to the development of public land ownership in the U.S., the majority of land from the Ohio Valley toward the Atlantic had been settled. These were densely populated areas that left little to no room for restrictive uses. Westward expansion and the lack of land quality for agriculture made it more likely that these areas would fall under the purview of public land. This is, of course, outside of the consideration of these lands being originally owned and inhabited by indigenous populations who were unceremoniously and often violently removed from their lands. In general, public land is managed under single-use restrictions and multiple-use practices. Single-use restrictions provide for lands to be either completely restricted or moderately restricted. Private land is managed similarly. It can be managed under a single-use practice, which is designated by zoning laws. Zoning laws are regulations that identify a particular use of land as being solely for the purpose of residence or industry, for example. These laws are done to attempt to find the best use of the land in question. Additionally, zoning allows for various streams of property taxes that can help to support the needs and services of an urban area. Some land may be designated as mixed use, meaning that residential, commercial, and recreational land can be adjacent or even all together. We will explore this idea further as we discuss methods of urbanization and the movement to new urbanism. When we talk about private land, we're often talking about urbanization and the development of areas where people live. Urbanization occurs in one of four major patterns. Three of those are demonstrated in the image at the right of this slide. The first is the concentric circle model. In this model, the central business district, known as the CBD, is the true center of the urban area. Other industry and living areas grow up in concentric rings at generally fixed orders from the CBD. The biggest giveaway of the concentric zone model is the centralized CBD and the fact that affluence increases proportionally to distance from the CBD. Modern examples of concentric cities include New York and London. The second is the sector city model. There is still a CBD, but the growth of the city develops along transportation corridors in such a way that they appear like pie wedges. One of the best examples is Chicago. It is important to note, however, that the concentric zone model was originally patterned after Chicago, but further growth shifted the understanding of the city to a sector city model. Third is the multiple nuclei model. This model shows areas that are growing rapidly and often do not have an overly large CBD. Smaller nuclei may have their own specialized CBDs and very distinct neighborhoods. The best example is Los Angeles, with neighborhoods like Beverly Hills, Oakland, and Hollywood. The last model is a newly developed one that is known as the vertical city. In this case, rather than grow horizontally, the city grows vertically. This may be upwards or downwards, and it may take large amounts of use of multiple use zoning. The best example of this is Tokyo and other Asian coastal cities. We know that over half of the population of the world is in urban areas. Furthermore, we know that this number is increasing and doing so rapidly. Comparatively, there are more people in urban areas in developing countries than in developed countries. This has led to poverty, originally a more rural problem, to become increasingly urban. This is largely due to the growth of cities through natural increase and immigration, much of which is driven by what we know as push and pull factors. We will discuss these in a moment. There have been many shifts in terms of urbanization over time. The overall shift has been from rural to urban areas and then into suburbs and exurbs. Over half of the urban dwellers in the U.S. live in a suburb. Additionally, migration has moved people from the heavily populated Northeast toward the South and West in what is known as suburban flight. This has become even more problematic during the 1990s when the majority of people have left the city and its suburbs and began expanding back into rural areas. Here you can see the general trend in urbanization. While rural population has remained relatively constant since the early 1900s, urban populations have skyrocketed since 1930. Part of this can be due to the migration towards cities during the Great Depression and the events of the Dust Bowl. It continued to increase during World War II and beyond after the baby boom. Additionally, there are many factors that determine whether or not an individual is likely to come to or leave an urban area. Push factors are those that force individuals to leave the rural area for the urban area, and these include poverty and war. Pull factors are those that draw individuals toward the urban areas, such as jobs, education, and entertainment. Some factors can be described as either push or pull, depending upon whether they are good or bad. Good or attractive factors tend to be those that are pull, while bad or negative factors are those that are push. The wording plays a large part in whether it is a push or a pull factor. As urban areas grow, they may fall into the category of being a megacity, or a city that has more than 10 million people. An example is the New York Newark metropolitan area. In 1950, there were only two megacities, the New York Newark area and Tokyo. By 2020, there were 25, the majority of which are located in Asia. As these cities grow, sometimes two or more megacities merge together as they become connected along transportation corridors. Good examples of this is the Bowash Corridor, the 800-kilometer urban area from Washington, D.C. to Boston that encompasses 35 million people. This is called a megalopolis. Other examples include the Tokushima region in Japan, which encompasses Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Kobe, and the Paris to Amsterdam corridor in Europe. Cities can continue to grow into what are known as hypercities, which have more than 20 million people. The top 3 hypercities in the world as of 2020 are Tokyo, Delhi, and Shanghai. Infrastructure is a major part of any urban or rural area. Infrastructure is made up of all those things needed to support life in the area. These include bridges, streets and roads, housing, pipelines, sewers, dams, schools, hospitals, and police and fire departments. It can also include technological infrastructure, such as power grids, telephone lines, and cable lines. The image here shows the myriad resources that play a part in the infrastructure of a small city. It is important to note that in many areas, the infrastructure is old and outdated. In particular, these struggling infrastructures can be found in areas that are labeled inner cities, or what lack appropriate tax bases. This loss of tax base can be the result of what is known as urban flight. This occurs when wealthy individuals leave the inner city to move towards suburbs. The loss of tax dollars leads to urban blight, where the physical and social environments of the city degrade. It is important to note that urban blight is often associated with largely minority areas and can be the result of the sociological phenomenon called white flight. This is a driving factor toward urban sprawl, where urban areas spread into local suburban areas, creating what we know as the suburbs. These can go even further towards something called suburban sprawl, where the suburbs expand further outward. We will come back to this thought in just a moment. Urban expansion, leading to urban and suburban sprawl, is a product of many different causes. Urban sprawl really began to accelerate in the aftermath of World War II, when there was vast tracts of cheap land and loan guarantees for single-family homes for veterans. This led to expansion of low-density housing, which was assisted by the Highway Trust Fund and the National Highway Interstate Act, both of which encouraged the use of cars. The Highway Trust Fund provided federal funding to develop and maintain highways by using taxes from gasoline. This led to what is known as induced demand. This is a result of the supply of a good leading to an increased demand for it. It works like this. Car use increases in urban areas, leading to congestion and longer commutes. More gasoline is used to travel from home to work and back again, which leads to an increase in tax revenue, which allows for more highway construction. This can lead to urban expansion, and the process begins again. The cycle continues in a positive feedback loop, encouraging further and further migration from the urban center. The addition of the Eisenhower Interstate System, a product of the Highway Interstate Act, provided more opportunity for travel and led to the development of new industries such as fast food. It is interesting to note that the original purpose of the interstate system was inspired by the Autobahn in Germany. During his time as a general in World War II, Eisenhower was baffled by how quickly German troops could move from one place to another. When he became president, Eisenhower instituted the interstate system for the primary purpose of moving military personnel from one part of the country to another quickly. One of the products of urbanization and urban expansion is what is known as gentrification. This process occurs when inner city or other areas are reclaimed and revitalized, often to the detriment of the minorities who live in the area. Gentrification happens on a standard cycle. The initial development, which drives up property values, the decline and stagnation that is often the result of urban blight and phenomena like white flight, which drives property values down, and then the revitalization and gentrification, which drives property values back up. Gentrification often occurs in areas that are considered part of the inner city. Often the initial development, higher incomes leave. The lowering property values make it possible for those of lower income, who are more often than not minorities or immigrants, to live in the area. However, as the property values drop, it becomes interesting to investors to revitalize. New businesses enter the area, driving up property values and often displacing those who live there. Areas that were once largely minority are now predominantly white and extremely expensive. As with everything else, there are pros and cons of urbanization practices. We know that urban areas are centers of economic development, education, technology, and jobs. They lead to lower infant mortality and higher life expectancy in individuals in urban areas due to better access to education and medical care. Urban areas can also facilitate sustainable living through the use of recycling, high-density housing, and mixed-use zoning, as well as the use of mass transportation such as trains and buses. Additionally, urban areas can use less land by growing up rather than growing out. However, we also know that urban areas have high ecological footprints in their carbon and other GHG emissions. Their lack of vegetation can lead to what is known as an urban heat island. This occurs when the urban area is considerably warmer than the rural areas around them. This is due to the extensive amounts of dark and reflective surfaces found in the urban area. Heat is absorbed in dark surfaces and continually reflected through the use of glass and steel. Urban heat islands are an example of a microclimate, and they can be avoided by using light-colored surfaces and rooftop gardens. Furthermore, urban areas can lead to problems with water access, particularly if sewage is not treated properly. Dense urban areas can increase the likelihood that a waterborne disease could spread through the population. Urban areas are also notorious for runoff pollution. Impermeable surfaces like parking lots and sidewalks make it impossible for rainwater to infiltrate the soil, and they often carry with them oil and gasoline residue when they move into bodies of water. Urban areas are also known to concentrate pollution and heat, leading to what is known as a thermal inversion. A thermal inversion occurs when the normal pattern of atmospheric air layering changes. Rather than getting colder as it moves further from the surface, a layer of warm air gets trapped between two layers of cool air. This prevents the dissipation of heat and pollutants and can contribute to urban heat islands and concentrated pollution. Smart growth and new urbanism are both practices and thought processes that seek to make the most of urban areas while pushing for more conservation, preservation, and moderation of resource use. Smart growth is based on the practice of mixed use, walkability, and sense of place in urban areas. A walkable city is one in which everything that an individual needs is within comfortable walking distance. Mixed-use zoning makes this possible by having apartments, offices, and retail areas within close proximity, sometimes even in the same building. Providing a variety of living and transportation options also increase the chances that stakeholders will buy into the smart growth designed urban area. In particular, transit-oriented development can help to reduce the amount of cars that are being used by providing reliable and convenient public transportation within areas that are already compact. This reduces the resource use of fossil fuels, as well as the materials needed to make the cars for transport. All of these practices lead to urban areas that have a distinct personality and character, or a sense of place, and can become what we know as eco-cities, a city that is designed for humans rather than cars. New urbanism is the application of practices such as cluster development and green belts to help limit urban growth and to maintain as much of the natural ecosystem as possible. Cluster development is associated with urban sprawl, where homes and businesses are built in such a way that they minimize the disturbance of the land around it. Special consideration is paid to waterways and existing stands of trees and other ecosystem areas. A similar method, known as greenbelts, can be applied to existing urban areas. The greenbelt is an area of greenery, trees or parks, that can be managed specifically to limit the outer rim of urban growth. The following slide provides you with an opportunity to see how some of these ideas are connected together. Feel free to pause the video and explore the connections between these topics. Then, use the statements at the beginning to review.